I am really humbled to be here. I have such a deep connection to this place. First, I wanted to thank Ngāti Whatua for their guardianship and security for this land and acknowledge their ownership, and also the warm welcome they gave this morning as well. This building is one which is something which is deep in my psyche. I'm not a religious man, but whenever I was in Auckland, I grew up in Auckland, you'd come across the harbour and you'd see it. It was kind of like our equivalent of a cathedral. It just dominated the skyline. And I can remember being here as a young person with my family, my Kiwi part of my family, and my great uncle telling me the battles that my family had fought in the First World War and the Second World War. And then as I got to know my Scottish side of my family, they would talk to me about the same battles that were fought with different battalions, but in the same locations. And so it taught me not just about the importance of this building for us as a country, but my own identity and the way that where we have been and where we are going, stretched through many places. And it's hard because it was always something which was meant to be in the past and something that we're meant to remember, kind of like Anzac Day. But it was meant to be history, and the world has changed. And so what I wanted to talk about was the way the world has changed now and what it means for us and our country. And it's difficult because I feel that we are at a point where we have to make generational choices which have been avoided for such a long time. But here we are, and this is where we began. And that's Peter Fraser up there, one of our better prime ministers. And he was responsible. He had his fingerprints all over the UN when it was formed. So New Zealand was, if there's a point where we became sort of independent, it's in the 1930s with the League of Nations. But then as the League of Nations folded, we went back into conflict. We reverted to traditional patterns. You can see the original UN there, which was formed as a body to fight fascism. And you can see the New Zealand flag there. And so we were there. We were part of the debates about the Charter, especially around the Security Council. Fraser was very important with the Declaration of Human Rights. We were instrumental, not just with global security, but also with regional security, with the Canberra Pact. And the Canberra Pact was an agreement we struck with Australia in 1944. And it's our one binding defence treaty to this day, because everything else is kind of ambiguous. But that's the one we were probably, not certainly, but probably obliged to defend Australia. But it was the language of the Charter that always struck me, and that was, we the people of the United Nations. And twice in our lifetime, the people who wrote this had seen 2 world wars. No, not just one, but 2. And they wanted to create a new order that was based upon justice, human rights, and international law. And New Zealand was part of that. But it didn't, as we know, you had the Korean War, you had the Vietnam War, you had the Cold War, you had all of that tension. This is where I come in. That's my poster. I did that when I was 15 years old. I was, believe it or not, once a hippie. And I used to work for, this is what happens to hippies when you grow up. And I used to work for Greenpeace, and I did the poster, and it was about a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. And I was going to art school. And when the Rainbow Warrior came in, I was one of 3 volunteers who turned up to paint it. And the reason it always looked so good in the water was I just finished painting it. And had the French done it a few days earlier, it would have saved me a lot of work. But they didn't. And my life changed. My life changed because I realised that the world was a much more serious place than where I was going to art school. And people think that the Ardern government was radical, but they forget how radical the Longi government was in that period. When we changed not just in terms of our nuclear-free policy, but our environmental policy, the way we gave retrospective powers to the Treaty of Waitangi, the tribunal, the way we thought about conservation. And it was just an amazing period. And we paid a price. We did pay a price. We became nuclear-free. America in 1986 said, that's it. We don't have obligations to you anymore under ANZUS. And we struggled as a country. But then we hit this fantastic period of the 1990s. And this is just I thought we were going to live forever. I thought this was the point where we'd really succeeded and everything came together. This is Reagan and Gorbachev, and this is the This is international law. This is when the arms agreement started to work. We got the first treaty on intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe. This broke the Cold War. We almost got the comprehensive test ban treaty. We got a convention forces in Europe, conventional forces. So you had amounts of tanks you could have on both sides of the border between Russia and the West. We had the first nuclear agreements, START 1 and START 2. And we started to ratchet down the numbers of nuclear weapons you could possess in this world. And we had safeguards. And the safeguards were things like, if you're going to test an intercontinental missile, you have to tell the Russians you're going to do it so they don't get completely freaked out. And we had safeguards like if you're going to do a large war games, you can't do certain things. Like you can't put all of your kit into the air and put your prime minister under the ground at the same time. Because it looks very much like an attack. But so it worked. The arms control worked. The Security Council worked. We got intervention in Kuwait. We got humanitarian intervention in Somalia, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda. We were actually cooperating as a community. International humanitarian law blossoms. The International Criminal Court comes into being. We've got this idea that there is accountability for all crimes committed in war. And the economy just booms. We get the World Trade Organization. We get globalization. And between 1995 and 2020, we go from 55 trillion in world GDP to 108. It doubles by 2020. And we all benefit from this prosperity. And here's the bulletin of the atomic scientists, and it's going backwards. This is a metaphor. This isn't a real clock. This is a metaphor for how close a number of distinguished people think we are to extinction. And it's at 17 minutes to midnight. And, I grew up as a really paranoid teenager thinking that the nuclear war was just around the corner. And you got to the 1990s and it just seemed to disappear. And all that fear just seemed to move away. And, our own country, we expand, we develop, we deepen our peacekeeping, we serve on the Security Council, our economic growth just goes through the roof. It does really well. And not just our economic growth, is us as a cosmopolitan country. We become so more diverse, so more inclusive, such a better place. But the economics of it is really important. And at the base of this economics is our relationship with China. Because we had a really bizarre relationship with Britain. And at one point, 60% of our trade was going to the UK. And we know what happened then, right? And so that all disappeared. But now we've got put all of our eggs in a different basket. Now we've got 34% of our trade going to China. And so, but we've grown from this, and it's bringing us $33 billion per year. And this is good. And this is optimism. And then you wake up. And then you start thinking, where did those years go? Jacinda Ardern gave a speech, a very good speech, and she said it's grim out there. And she also said it was sometimes it was reported that it's bloody grim out there. I think she made a mistake, and I think it wasn't bloody grim. I think it was brothers grim, and because brothers grim was the story of someone who fell asleep and woke up decades later, and everything had changed. And that's New Zealand. That's where we are now. And that's the bulletin of the atomic scientists and the clock. And it's now 90 seconds to midnight. And so you went from 17 minutes, and it's just gone click, 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 all the way up to the point now where we haven't been this close to whatever happens when it strikes at midnight. And so I start saying to myself, well, where did it go wrong? Where did this trajectory of optimism that we had and expectations that things were getting better become so wrong? And I think it's probably that point there when the world changed. Now, I was trying to explain this to my students the other day, and I was saying, September the 11th, 2001, it's a day you'll always know where you were. You'll always remember when you turned on the telly and you saw it. And I looked up to the audience, and they looked at me, and they just stared. And half of them hadn't been born. And so I was trying to explain a change of when the world was. But it's like, I imagine, when our grandparents were talking to us about the First World War, or it was just so distant. They might have been talking about Waterloo for all we knew. It was so far, but this is where we changed. And so we went into Afghanistan and the war on terror, and that was a legal war. But then the war kind of morphed, and then we started to chase maybe terrorists into Iraq, and then we have an illegal war. And then the war spreads, and it starts to be not so much in between states, but between groups. And Islamic State rises to the fore. And you get a completely different type of challenge. And the rules start to blur, because you're also starting to find at this point that things like torture come back into debate. And so you've got lawless war, you've got war without rules. America has nothing to do with the International Criminal Court. And New Zealand did the right thing. New Zealand got involved in Afghanistan through a relationship with NATO, which was commendable. We stayed out of the first Iraq war, which was correct. Helen Clark got that decision right. It was legally wrong. But we went back into Iraq in 2015 when Islamic State. But that was a bilateral invitation. And so we struggle with that. But what I'm trying to tell you here is that these patterns, they weren't in isolation. So the illegal behavior that you see now with Putin in Russia isn't just a Russian invention. There were other countries that were breaking the rules well before Russia. And I would argue in many ways, not completely, but in many ways, Putin learnt this behavior. He could see that you could illegally invade another country and there would be no consequences. There's a debate. There's a big debate about when NATO expanded. Was there a promise that it would never go into the former Eastern European countries? And it seems that maybe there was an oral kind of promise, but as anyone knows who's ever done law, if you've got an oral promise, it's worth nothing. And in an age of treaties, you should have just had the people write it down that this would never happen. But it was never recorded as a treaty obligation. NATO did expand. But the thing that probably completely freaked them out was when the Americans developed anti-ballistic missiles and the missile shield started to expand. And the Americans, to do this, they had to withdraw from one of those nuclear treaties. He gets involved in Chechnya. Then he gets involved in Chechnya again. Then he gets involved in Georgia. Then he gets involved in the Ukraine. And each time you're seeing a similar pattern of intervention. You're often seeing wars which are disproportionate, wars which are inhumane, and wars which don't ever really end. There's no treaty at the end of it. There's just this succession of conflict. And then you get 2014, you get MH17, the jet airliner, which everyone's forgotten about, and the atrocity there. You get him sending agents to Britain to poison people with chemical weapons. And my head just starts to hurt, because it's not just Russia. It's not just Russia which is now misbehaving. And it's not just America. You've also got the problem of China now. Not necessarily always illegal, sometimes illegal, certainly abrasive. You've got the South China Sea. You've got island building, where you create human-made things in the middle of the ocean and you try to claim sovereignty around it. And right now we let our frigates do speed runs right past them, right up to 12 nautical miles. You don't want to go over that line. You see the promises made and not kept about the autonomy of Hong Kong and the national security law. We see human rights abuses of a potentially, I'm very careful with this, a potentially genocidal scale, but we can't advance them. And then you've got Taiwan, the most dangerous part on earth. And Mr. Biden, there was this kind of understanding since the 1970s, red line areas that you wouldn't go over. You wouldn't say, we will defend Taiwan, because if you say that, you're going to get a reaction. And as China is growing in its strength and its intentions, Biden comes out and says, we will defend Taiwan. And so the whole context, the whole basis of stability that we once had is now moving into a different trajectory. And in the Pacific, it's no longer just out there. It's no longer in these faraway countries it takes 8 hours to get to on a plane. It's now just over the horizon. And we see the Chinese influence in our part of the world. And we see, obviously, the new security agreement with the Solomons, and that's important. But the one that I'm watching right now is the amount of Chinese money that goes around the Pacific. And the problem with this is we are meant to look after the Pacific. It's one of our obligations. But the problem is that we haven't. We have not done it. You haven't just got developing countries in the Pacific, you've got least developed countries in the Pacific. These aren't poor, these are dirt poor. And we have got, I would argue, a ethical, a cultural, and a moral responsibility to these communities. But we've let it go. We don't give enough aid. And other countries have come in, like China, and they've now said, we're not going to give you aid. Don't get me wrong. We'll give you a loan. And giving loans to poor countries is just a disaster. But they will give loans for things that we won't give loans for. They will give loans for airports and ports and bridges. We're doing more of the good stuff, the human rights stuff. And that's commendable, and that's right. But it's hard to go to these communities and say, don't take the money. Because so this is challenging us to where we're meant to be. And then you think, well, it's all right. We built that fantastic thing that I was talking about right at the beginning, the UN and the Security Council. And we kind of made a trade. And the trade was, we're going to give you guys ultimate power if you keep peace and security in the world. And the deal was, the Security Council was never meant to end war. It wasn't. It was meant to prevent the Third World War. That's it. That's the bottom line. And so it's kind of worked for such a long time. And so we've got these 5 men here who hold the fate of the world in their hand. And you kind of think, well, we're rational. It's the 21st century. We're going to get to a point where we're going to get good decisions. But what you're starting to see is that the Security Council is not working like it was meant to work. That hope that we had that the 5 could agree and intervene where they needed to is becoming increasingly forlorn. The big difficulty we have is the veto. The permanent 5 have the veto, and that means that they can say no, ultimately no, to UN intervention into a country as an offensive conflict, or they can stop condemnation of something else. We've always seen the veto. You can see it there in the top corner going through. There's the historic patterns. The Russians were always really useful, very quick with the hammer, and with the Soviets, I should say. And then you can see the Americans. Most of the Americans debates about Israel and Palestine. And then you get to that point in the 90s, those lovely years that I was talking to you about, where it kind of stopped. And then it started to change. And the way the veto is changing now is that you're seeing China starting to use the veto. They never used to use it. Now it's becoming much more common, sometimes in tandem with Russia. And so you can get to a conflict like Syria, that you're losing nearly 500,000 people. 500,000 people. One of the worst conflicts we've seen in recent times. And 12 resolutions are vetoed by either Russia or by China. You can't talk about humanitarian assistance. You can't talk about the rules of war. You can't talk about the International Criminal Court. It's like you can just parcel off 500,000 deaths and push it to one corner and not debate it anymore. And so this body, which we thought would help, is now becoming not so useful. You see the same problem with the Ukraine. You can't condemn the invasion. You can't condemn the annexations. You can't support the International Criminal Court. Any attempt for a veto, it's gone. But in some ways, that's not news, because that's always been there. But what is news is the way that the Western countries are losing control of the other bodies in the UN. The bottom one is the Human Rights Council. And so the Human Rights Council was given a report that there may be a genocide going on in China. And the Human Rights Council, by vote, said, we're not going to look at it. And so we don't control the numbers in the organizations anymore. And so even when you're in the General Assembly, you can condemn the invasion, but 31 countries sit on the fence. And so this whole idea that the UN was going to protect us is now questionable. So where are we? I work in international law, so I count treaties. I know it's kind of odd and somewhat sad, but it's what I do. And we have lost 9 treaties. We have lost 9 treaties since 1999. You never got your Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. America said no. You lost the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. America walked out. You didn't get a bioweapons protocol. And this is another long story, but that's partly got to do with COVID as well, because you can't inspect other people's biological laboratories, dual-use type ones. China never joins the International Criminal Court. Russia walks out. America says no, we'll have nothing to do with it. Trump gives the finger to Europe over the INF Treaty. That was the one that broke the Cold War. The conventional forces disappeared. There's no more restraint over what you can put on each other's border. The Open Skies Agreement, where you could fly over each other's country to ensure that there was compliance, it's gone. Russia withdrew from international humanitarian law agreements, additional ones. And the last one, which happened a couple of weeks ago, they've suspended the START Treaty. And the START Treaty was it's the last big international agreement on nuclear weapons that has a threshold of how many the Russians can have and how many the Americans can have. And so you've lost all that. And what you haven't got right now, you've got no regional arms control. We haven't got agreements between India and Pakistan and China. We have not got rules on cyber attacks. We haven't got rules on artificial intelligence in warfare. And we've got really patchy compliance and safety mechanisms. So right now, you can do the most insane things. You can be in North Korea. You can send a missile over Japan. You may even announce that that missile is nuclear capable, and you expect them to suck it up. You can have war games on the border of North Korea where you put all of the kit up in the air and you expect the North Koreans to sit there and wonder if it's an attack coming or not coming. And so all of these things that we got. But what I'm trying to show here, it wasn't just the Russians. The Americans withdrew, the Russians withdrew, everyone's withdrawn. And so what I want to do now is I want to just look at 3 questions, because I want you to take away something practical from today about what do we do now? What do we do as a country, as New Zealand? Aotearoa, this place. First thing, you've got to watch the Ukraine. This is just a ticking time bomb. But before I talk about the war, the thing I want you to think about here is the way that the war can impact other communities that are unconnected to the conflict. We face a global hunger pandemic. There's nearly 1 million people in famine-like conditions. And right now, the importance of this is that the Ukraine war involved a blockade that stopped the Ukrainians being able to export many of their food sources. Most of the world doesn't rely on Ukrainian food. Some parts do. Lebanon, parts of Egypt, it's important. But what it does is the blockade caused inflation, and it made food prices jump really quickly. 22% global food prices. It wasn't just New Zealand. Global food prices 22% last year. And so the risk you've got now, and Putin's been very clear about this will not be renewed unless he starts to get some relief on sanctions. And so you're seeing a type of behavior where you threaten world hunger. We haven't even got a name for this type of crime, where you threaten world hunger unless you get something in return. So that's the first thing. But you've got to watch this war, because this war is going in the wrong direction. The weaponry is increasing. You start off as we did, as I was arguing right at the beginning, give the Ukrainians helmets and flak jackets. And you start off with non-lethal military equipment. And then you move to lethal. And then the list, you see it on the news. First off, you don't give them the long-range artillery, then you do. Then you don't give them long-range missiles, then you do. Then you have to give them the next generation of tanks, they arrive. Big debate now, fighter aircraft, you give them fighter aircraft. You'll start off saying no, but we'll give them to them. And so the weaponry is expanding. The crimes are expanding. The focus on children at the beginning, this is our first focus. There's going to be a long list of crimes. It's not just the children. The children are the most obvious, blatant example, and it's horrendous what's happened there. But it will go from children, targeting hospitals, indiscriminate actions, disproportionate actions, use of illegal munitions. And then there's the nuclear threats. It almost becomes wallpaper that you can kind of just get up and you think, oh yeah, Putin said he's going to move tactical nukes to Belarus. I wonder what if Prince Charles is going to the coronation. And it's just, every day it's there. And we keep thinking, hopefully it's just like that story about the boy who cries wolf, and it's not going to happen. The thing that freaked me out completely last week was the breach of security intelligence in America. To me, it wasn't surprising that there was a breach. I mean, It was kind of surprising why. I mean, normally people sell out their country for money or ideology, or they're a whistleblower. It's pretty rare to sell it out because you're trying to impress your mates. But anyway, he did it. But the information that he gave over was, the thing that got me was he said that there were special forces, American and British and a few Dutch special forces in the war zone. And this is critical because what it means is that this war is contained if you don't have NATO boots on the ground. Because when you've got American soldiers shooting Russian soldiers, there's no more paper line between you. And it can escalate. And then you've got that casualty rate. If I had to pick the vulnerability of Putin, it's that. Putin's not going to run out of money. He's not going to run out of munitions, but he might run out of men. Because I work on the assumption that Russian mothers and Russian wives love their sons and their husbands just as much as anyone else. 55,000 was the figure in Vietnam when the Americans, when their own population said, this is unsustainable. But right now, he's lost 100,000 and it will grow. And so I see his risk as internal dissension for what can happen next. But for us, there's a call. The Chinese have called for a ceasefire. The Chinese have put a peace proposal on the table. It's a 12-point peace proposal. It's kind of in a tradition of like what Wilson did with the 14-point in the First World War, where a neutral country comes in and they make an idea. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. But they've said, as a first principle, respect the sovereignty of all countries. That means Russia get out of the Ukraine. There's a lot of things missing in this proposal. There's no discussion about war crimes. There's no discussion about restitution. But if you don't look at the Chinese peace proposal, you've got two alternatives. You've got Putin, and he knows what he wants. He wants Eastern Europe to disarm and leave NATO. He's put a draft treaty for us to sign on the table. He wants Eastern Europe to disarm. He also expects the annexations to become Russian sovereign territory. And then on the other side, you've got Zelensky and a lot of Western backers, and they're saying, we want to take everything back, and we want all of the territory, and we want to put Putin in The Hague, and we want to put him in jail. And so you've got these two sides, and the Chinese have come right through the middle. And the thing with the China, you can't see it because I'm in front of the panda bear just here. He's panda bear. And panda bear's on a fence. And China right now is the panda bear on a fence. And it's remarkable that it's on a fence. But it's balancing between Russia and the West. And the big question is, will they provide weapons to Russia if the peace proposal fails? And no one knows the answer to that, but it's possible, even though it would be in violation of international law. So what do we do? One, New Zealand, what we must do. First of all, be consistent. We are consistent. Support international law. It was an illegal invasion, and our Prime Minister, the opposition, and Mr. Hipkins are all good, and they've got the line right. And crimes must be accounted for. There must be no impunity for these crimes. We have applied sanctions for the first time, and it's so hard because we always did our sanctions through the UN. The UN would say, these are the bad guys, put sanctions on them, and we'll go and create a list. UN's not working. We've now created our own sanctions list. And when you create your own sanctions list, we say, of course the UN's not working, we're going to focus on Russia. Okay, now we're going to focus on Iran. And you see, if we start setting it unilaterally, it's a much more difficult debate. But we need to do more. We need to open up our immigration. I argue we should accept more refugees. And I argue that because I think we have a responsibility, because we are not neutral. New Zealand is not neutral in this conflict. We are not a bystander. We are actively engaged in this war. And if we are engaged, I think we have a moral responsibility to help these people more than we are. We can do more. We can give them the light armoured vehicles that they're asking for. Expand the refugee quota, provide more assistance for what we can help them to choose their own weapons that they need. Here's one that is a problem for Mr. Hipkins. What an invitation, crikey. It's kind of like those invitations you get and like you don't really want to go, but you can't really say no. And so obviously our Prime Minister went to NATO, Jacinda Ardern went to NATO when it was in Spain, and that was important because that was the beginning of the Ukraine war. But this one is in Vilnius, which is in Lithuania, which is right next to Belarus. So this is very, very close to the action where it's going to happen. Mr. Hipkins has not yet decided whether he will go yet or not. New Zealand is a partner to NATO. We've been a partner since 2012. There's 37 other partners. We can't join NATO. NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so as much as we wish we were in part of the North Atlantic, we're not. We're in the South Pacific. But we can be their friend, but we can't join them. But the focus of NATO is now moving. Yes, they acknowledge that Russia is a threat, but last year they said China is a possible threat. Not a certain threat, maybe a threat, but a possible threat. And so Mr. Hipkins now has to work out, is he going to attend this meeting and continue to grow his relationship with NATO, or is he going to go elsewhere? It's a very difficult choice. I say go. I think it's very important he should go. I think we need to continue to support our solidarity. But here's the last one, and this is one that Robert and I were writing about in the last couple of days, and this is the choice of a generation. There's a new agreement in town, and this is the AUKUS agreement. And the AUKUS agreement is the agreement between Australia, Britain, and America for the exchange of nuclear propulsion. In a nutshell, it's about giving nuclear-powered submarines between the three of them. And Australia's going to buy a handful of them as well, at great expense. It came out of the blue. It's the first new agreement for a while. And the funny thing is, like, the acronym used to be ANZUS, but NZ fell out of it and the Brits jumped into it, and now it's AUKUS, which is kind of confusing because the original ANZUS agreement is the one which has kind of got the obligations of defence, whereas AUKUS is kind of like a technology agreement. But we're not sure what that means if you get invaded. And then it's got more complicated because it's not just about nuclear submarines, because clearly we've got no interest. We can't even afford them, let's be honest. And we've only got 2 frigates, so we're not going to buy nuclear submarines. But there is this other really big basket of neat stuff. There's artificial intelligence, there's quantum capabilities, there's cybersecurity, there's undersea artificial intelligence, hypersonic, counter-hypersonic. This is Star Trek kind of stuff. But this is the stuff, this is my politics coming through. Our military is at risk of falling behind. And the next war, if there is another conflict, we need to be combat ready. And so we've got to be prepared to be thinking about this next generation of weaponry. And this is a hard debate. And so New Zealand interested in this Pillar 2 part of it. We're interested in looking at, like, what does all this basket of stuff look like for us? We're not Pillar 1, and these 3 guys are saying, well, maybe you can rejoin AUKUS. We're not sure what we're going to do with the acronym, but we're interested that you could rejoin. And we face this debate now. What do we do? What do we do? What do you do? Crikey, I was the guy who painted the Rainbow Warrior. I was the one who was in Auckland Harbour looking up, and I could actually see the museum, and I never thought, I could see us being independent, but I never thought I'd be up here saying we should or should not join AUKUS. Because for me, we were meant to live happily ever after when we got to the 1990s, and that world's gone. And so we already support the rule of law. We have already used our frigates with some war games. We send them around the South China Sea. We don't send them through the Taiwan Strait. That would be very naughty and very dangerous as well. But when we do it with the Brits. We don't do it with the Americans or the Australians. So we're already part there. But you've got this big debate right now. What do you do with AUKUS? Because Mr. Little is having these discussions. Do we join? Don't we join? There's 2 arguments. The argument for joining. The argument for joining AUKUS is that international law is fragmenting. You are losing your treaties. There's a lot of tension out there. You can see the rise of Russia. You can see the rise of China. There is a logic about a common deterrent collective where we share the costs and carry our bit of weight. You can think of your traditions. It makes sense that we work with countries we've worked with traditionally, and that's good. And they will give us, the next generation, they will give us that basket of stuff that looks really cool to play with for the military. And if you don't get it, they would argue, maybe you don't get the basket. But That's convincing. That's a convincing argument. But then on the other side, the problem is multiple as well. First off, we have an independent foreign policy, and we've worked so hard to get this over the decades. But if we go back into AUKUS, does ANZUS become operative again? What does that mean for America? Here's your dilemma. Here's your simple dilemma. If America gets into a fight over Taiwan, if Australia gets pulled into the fight to help America, and we're obliged by a 1944 treaty to help Australia, does that piece of string that started in Taiwan end up in Auckland? We don't know. But these are the things that you've got to think about. What does it do to our foreign policy? What does it do to our obligations? If we join AUKUS, even if you can divide off the nuclear component, we will add to the arms race. We will be part of that escalation. And it will, and some of the new technology, artificial intelligence in warfare, is unregulated. And we're already nervous about it, but we would be partaking in that. And then the question is, what will we do with the Pacific? Because we have obligations to the Pacific that we have to think about. The Rarotonga Treaty, the protocols to the Rarotonga Treaty, this idea that you would try to keep it not just nuclear free, but a better type of independence and security. So, conclusion. I apologise because you were quite happy before I started to talk. So, first off, this is what I argue. One, deepen your support for the Ukraine. It's important. It's the right thing to do. Two, go to NATO. That I think is also justifiable. Three, this is controversial. Give peace a chance. I would argue, look seriously at the Chinese peace proposal. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point, and you've got to start somewhere. But what's happened is that the Chinese have put the proposal onto the table, and the Western countries have just said, this is terrible. No, and that's wrong. I think we should seriously look at it and give peace a chance. With AUKUS, yes, no. Yes, no. I think it's correct to explore the options of AUKUS, but be so careful. Because right now we are making generations that only occur once in a generation. That's it.